When I'm not working as the host with the most here, I like to spend my time running a lot of miles, reading as many books as I can, and getting absolutely annihilated by my friends in Mario Kart. It's the simple things that bring me joy. For you, it may be walking your chickens, or shopping for vintage clothes. Whatever it is that isn't work counts as leisure. And the choice you make about when to work and when to walk your chickens really affects the economy, where more labor means more production, more income, and more spending. But while economics sees how much to work as a tricky choice facing us all, for many people, the decision between labor and leisure isn't as much of a choice as we'd like it to be. Hi, I'm Matt Sofa, and this is Study Hall, Macroeconomics. Nobody loves going to work every single day, no matter how great your job is. But you get some pretty cool stuff as a reward, like, money to do even cooler stuff, like, live. Each hour you spend at work is an example of a trade-off, when you have to give up something to get something else. So for each hour you sit on the couch losing at Mario Kart, you trade the $30 you could be earning running your beach supply store or bottling your own salad dressing. That's an example of an opportunity cost. To get even more specific about what you're giving up by staying home, you can divide your nominal wage, or the money you make at your job, by the current price level to give you your real wage. This gives your paycheck actual meaning, because it gives you information about the purchasing power of the money you're making, or how much stuff it can buy. And being able to buy stuff is the whole point of going to work. It's much harder to measure the opportunity cost in the other direction. You can't put a price on the joy of spending hours watching your friends zip past you on Rainbow Road, so the opportunity cost of working for an hour is much more subjective. The choice between labor and leisure is one of the trickiest, most nuanced trade-offs in economics. Often, it doesn't feel like you have a choice in the first place because the opportunity cost of not working is so high. Unless they're born the heir to a large and mysterious fortune, most people choose to work because they're unwilling to go without food and shelter. But what's going on in the labor market still has an impact on how many hours you take on. The labor market is the vast theoretical plane where workers sell their labor in exchange for pay, and also sometimes perks like health insurance and slightly stale bagels on Fridays. And how much people work is influenced by how well firms are willing to pay workers to trade in their leisure, copious amounts of Mario Kart, for labor, toiling away under hot studio lights in a YouTube studio. Basically, the more money I make for every hour of teaching students, hosting shows, preparing rice bowls, marketing salad dressing, and hawking surfboards, the more likely I am to sell my precious labor instead of vegging out on the couch. In this case, the labor supply curve would look like any other supply curve, slanting up and to the right. Just like a business willing to sell more of its products at a higher price point, people are down to sell more labor when they're getting more cold, hard cash for their efforts, or cold, hard direct deposits, whatever. This is an example of the substitution effect, because higher wages encourage workers to substitute labor for leisure. But there's another side to the story. As wages go up, that also means folks actually don't have to work brutal 80-hour weeks to make ends meet, and can instead take a little time to be people rather than just workers. This is an example of the income effect, and it can cause our labor supply curve to reverse. Whether the substitution effect or the income effect dominates for you personally is really a you question. If you're barely making ends meet, lower wages probably means more hours worked to keep scraping by. If you've got more of a financial cushion, it starts to feel a little more like a choice, and maybe $15 an hour isn't enough to sacrifice your precious me time. On a macro level though, we generally see a positive relationship between wages and hours worked, which means the more workers are getting paid, the more they're willing to work. Our labor supply curve looks an awful lot like other market supply curves we're used to, with labor supply increasing as wages go up too. Of course, there are some things that can shift the entire labor supply curve that have nothing to do with human choice. For example, an increase in population means more workers. Like, if suddenly a bunch of handsome, talented, brilliant YouTube hosts like me moved to Arizona, the supply of study hall hosts would increase, upping the available hosting hours and shifting the labor curve to the right. But if every host moved to Belize to hang out on the beaches and host shows over there, there would be fewer hosts available here, and therefore fewer hosting hours total, no matter how much you pay us. The labor supply curve for hosts here in the US would shift to the left. Cultural and social norms can also shift the labor population and therefore the supply curve. Today, in the 2020s, women are part of every aspect of the workforce. But back in the Dark Ages, and by Dark Ages I mean about 60 years ago, discrimination, antiquated social norms, wage gaps, and invisible labor at home prevented many women from working, especially in fields of science and technology. While women still face barriers in the workforce, slowly shifting norms, more access to education, anti-discrimination policies have made it somewhat easier for women to step into traditionally male-dominated fields, increasing the total workforce. Similarly, public health can shift the labor supply curve to the left or right too. A healthy workforce has more hours of work to offer, while if you're constantly calling out sick, that drops your total hours worked. And if firms are willing to make accommodations for workers with chronic health issues or other disabilities, we can increase the labor supply. So there's actually a really important economic argument for affordable healthcare and accessibility initiatives. If the whole human rights and equality thing didn't win you over, taxes can be another labor supply shifter, according to our model. If individual income taxes increase, that would decrease the take-home pay, even if firms keep paying the same amount. Since we generally see a positive relationship between wages and hours worked, less take-home pay would theoretically mean fewer hours worked. But if income taxes decrease, that essentially raises wages and people may be down to work more. Other government policies can shift labor supply too. If a government offers stipends to single parents or families living in poverty to help cover basic living expenses, a mother who might have used to need to work 60 hours a week to support her children might be able to drop down to a more reasonable 40. Of course, there are personal situations that can affect how much someone works at any wage rate too. Finding reliable, affordable childcare is a huge barrier to full-time employment because paying high prices to make sure your kids are taken care of adds to the opportunity cost of working. High-quality, affordable childcare options allow parents to re-enter the workforce, increasing labor supply. Ditto for things like reliable public transit. Someone who takes the bus to work is gonna put in more hours if the route is reliable and the fare is affordable, while a fare hike or a cut in service will reduce labor supply. Generally, a larger workforce is good for an economy. It means more people are getting paid and more stuff is getting made. That's how governments track how many people are involved in the labor market altogether, known as the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate measures what percentage of people are involved in the labor market, and it's a good signal to economists about the health of the economy as a whole. Low labor force participation drops economic activity and growth because if people aren't working, firms aren't producing, plus households out of the labor market won't have the income to invest back into the economy on chicken harnesses, running shoes, and all that other stuff that grows the GDP. But the first step to understanding what is going on in the labor market is figuring out who is involved in the first place. Thankfully, in the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a plan for that. The government surveys what's called the civilian non-institutional population, which basically means all adults who aren't in institutions like the army, prison, or residential care facilities. Adults in this case are those 16 years or older. And if you're thinking that 16-year-olds aren't adults, my nephew Josh and his newly grown mustache would disagree. Then they sort these adults into 3 categories based on their answers: employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. Not in the labor force describes anyone who isn't actively working or looking for a job. So your grandmother, full-time students, stay-at-home parents, trust fund, globe-trotting NYU grads, or your slacker roommate. Every other adult is part of the labor force, whether they like it or not, and can be categorized as either employed, if you have a job, or unemployed if you don't, but you've been hanging out on LinkedIn angling for an interview. To use this information to calculate the labor force participation rate, the BLS adds up the number of employed and unemployed folks and divides that number by the total civilian non-institutional population. Then, you multiply that by 100 to get a friendly, easy-to-use number. And if that number is too low, there are steps the government takes, like raising taxes on the people who are working in order to continue paying for stuff like schools and roads and Social Security. Labor participation rate can also go with our other economic temperature checks, like real GDP and CPI, to help us be better attuned to the health of a national economy in general. As a whole, the labor market looks a lot like other markets. But unlike other markets, this time it's the workers who've got the goods. You decide what's most important in your work-life balance. You decide whether time is indeed money, at least in theory. Often, the most important thing for workers is keeping food on the table and the creditors away from their doorstep, which makes the whole thing feel a lot less like a choice. No matter what, economists are watching to see what workers decide. They want to see if upping wages will boost economic participation, or if other factors like health, culture, population, and taxes will shift that labor supply curve to the left or to the right. So even when it feels like your boss owns your soul, remember, you own your labor, and the economy can't get anywhere without it. The choice between labor and leisure is yours, even if it really, really sucks. If you're enjoying this series and are interested in taking the full Study Hall Macroeconomics course and earning college credit from ASU, check out gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. And if you want to help us out, give this video a like, comment, and smash that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. See you next time.